Welcome back to the deep dive. Okay, when you hear the name Jonathan Edwards, what's the very first thing that pops into your head? For
Mm.
so many people, I bet it's that sermon, right? Sinners in the hands of an angry God.
Yeah, that's the one. Fire, brimstone. Pretty intense stuff.
Exactly. And look, it's definitely part of his story, a powerful part. But honestly, if that's all you know, well, you're missing the vast majority of who he was and what he thought. It's like um, judging this huge, amazing landscape from just one postcard.
That's a really, really good way to put it because, yeah, Sinners is significant historically, and it does show one aspect of how he saw God's justice and, human sinfulness. But if you stop there, you fundamentally misunderstand the man.
Okay.
Because the absolute core of his life, the engine driving him, wasn't a terror. It was this deep, almost overwhelming sense of God's beauty, his absolute sovereignty, his radiant, all-consuming glory. He wasn't just a scholar studying God from a distance. He was someone who, you can see it in his own words, genuinely enjoyed God. He talked about this delightful conviction, finding actual sweetness in God's sovereignty, and this deep satisfaction in the supreme excellency of divine things, just as they are in themselves.
So we're shifting the picture. Not just this stern, maybe dour figure, but someone totally captivated by divine beauty. And this is, well, America's top theologian philosopher, right?
Yeah.
A huge figure in the First Great Awakening.
Absolutely central.
And everything we've looked at suggests his life was just this relentless pursuit of God. An unwavering focus, you could say, on God being central to absolutely everything.
That's it, exactly. So for this deep dive, we really want to step behind one famous fiery image and explore the whole journey.
Okay.
See how his incredible intellect, his really personal spiritual experiences, his ministry work, even the massive trials he went through, how all of it in his mind was aimed at glorifying Jesus Christ and showing God's glory in all its facets.
Right.
Our mission, really, is to trace how his profound intellect, passionate spirituality, dedicated ministry, and steadfastness in trials serve to glorify Jesus Christ and reveal the multifaceted glory of God. We want to see the whole picture, not just that one corner.
Okay, let's do it. Where does this start? This
Yeah.
all-consuming focus on God's glory. What shaped him early on?
Well, it's clear his intellectual gifts were obvious really young. A precocious intellect is the phrase used. And he grew up in a devout household, steeped in that Puritan tradition. And understanding the Puritans is key here. It wasn't just about, church attendance or knowing doctrine, though that mattered.
Right.
There was this huge emphasis on personal piety, on godliness, the real heart of it.
So what did that actually look like for a Puritan? Was it about being super strict or like trying to earn God's favor?
No, not earning salvation, not at all. That's a common misconception. The Puritans were rock solid on salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, like the reformers before them. They believed acceptance with God came only through Christ's merits, his righteousness counted as theirs, and the Holy Spirit actually regenerating, changing their hearts. They called this monergistic, meaning God does the decisive work.
God's work, not ours.
Right. Your righteousness wasn't yours. It was Christ's imputed to you. So Puritan piety wasn't about trying to justify yourself. It was about living out the salvation God had already given you. It meant, ongoing confession of sin, constantly seeking God's grace to fight sin, to mortify it, they'd say, in your heart and life. It was a battle, yes, but fought from a place of already being accepted.
Okay, so piety is the result of salvation, not the cause. That's a
Mhm.
huge distinction. And for Edwards, this background, this focus on the inner life, it all kind of came together in a really pivotal experience for him, right? His
Yeah.
conversion.
Yes, that was the absolute turning point. When the theology he knew in his head became this living, felt reality, he talks about getting a new sense of God's glory.
A new sense. What does that mean?
Like before, he could understand God's attributes intellectually, but now he apprehended them, almost like a new spiritual taste or sight. And this new sense brought this delightful conviction, especially about God's absolute sovereignty.
Right.
He wrote about how this doctrine, which he'd actually found kind of difficult, maybe even objectionable before, suddenly it became an exceeding pleasant, bright, and sweet doctrine to me. He literally said, absolute sovereignty is what I love to ascribe to God. It wasn't just agreeing God was in charge, it was finding joy and beauty in that fact.
Wow. That's a massive shift from just thinking it's true to actually delighting in it.
Huge. And he came to believe that this kind of real conversion, this spiritual seeing, was the indispensable ingredient for any true relationship with God. Without it, all the religious activity, no matter how passionate, was just, empty forms. And this wasn't just some emotional high that faded. This encounter lit a fire under him, a lifelong, passionate dedication that drove everything. He wouldn't just study God abstractly anymore. He wanted to enjoy him, to know God not just with his mind, but with his emotions, his soul, his full capacity. Thinking deeply was part of loving God fully for him.
That's an incredible way to think about it, using your whole self, mind, and heart to know God.
Yeah.
But, the picture isn't just intense devotion. It's clear this didn't magically lift him above all the normal human struggles, right? Like sin and doubt.
And that's so important for getting a real picture. We shouldn't make him into some kind of spiritual Superman. He was absolutely a sinner, just like the rest of the race.
Yeah.
He's honest in his writings about times he doubted his salvation, times he really fought a great fight against his own indwelling sin, and sometimes he lost that fight. His life was this mix, the beauty of living for God mingled with the pain of living in sin.
That internal conflict.
It was constant. But what stands out is that he didn't just give up. He tried hard in seasons of difficulty to redeem them and to make them seasons of growth. He saw his failures not as the end, but as reasons to depend even more on God's grace. It makes him, more human, more relatable.
Absolutely. That honesty makes his dedication even more powerful, I think.
Yeah.
So, okay, this young man, brilliant mind, Puritan background, life-changing conversion, moves into public life. Where does this passion take him first?
It takes him into ministry, specifically to Northampton, Massachusetts. He was called to be the assistant pastor to his grandfather, Solomon Stoddard.
Stoddard.
He was a big deal, wasn't he?
Huge. Hugely influential figure in that whole region. They called him the river god, basically, because of his sway along the Connecticut River Valley. And Northampton wasn't some tiny backwater. It was a pretty significant frontier town then, maybe 1,100 people or so.
Okay.
And Edwards arrived with a reputation already for his intellect, his obvious devotion, his promise as a future leader. He seems like the clear successor to his grandfather. And it's in Northampton that he becomes this key player in the First Great Awakening. Maybe unpack that a bit. What was the Great Awakening and why was it so important?
Right, the First Great Awakening. Think of it as this series of widespread religious revivals that just swept through the colonies in the 1730s and 40s. Its impact was massive on multiple levels. But a really key thing was how it sort of democratized religion in a way that arguably helped prepare the ground for the American Revolution later.
How so? Democratized?
Well, before the Awakening, religious authority was often tied up with your social status, your education, who your family was. But the Awakening really shifted the focus onto the individual soul's relationship with God. Suddenly, what mattered most wasn't your position or class, but whether your soul was right with God.
I see.
This focus on personal conversion, on spiritual experience being available to anyone regardless of social standing, that was radical. It shook up the old order and gave people a new sense of individual spiritual importance. And Edwards wasn't just caught up in it. He was a major interpreter and defender of the Awakening, especially with his book, Some Thoughts Concerning the Present Revival. He tried to sort out the genuine work of God from, just emotional hype or weirdness.
Which brings us inevitably back to that sermon, sinners in the hands of an angry God. We know the stereotype, but what was its real role and purpose in the context of the Awakening and his ministry?
Yeah, sinners. Preached in Enfield, Connecticut, 1741. Famous or infamous maybe for those incredibly vivid, frankly terrifying images of an unconverted person's situation before God. And reports from the time confirm its impact. People apparently cried out audibly for salvation right there during the sermon. But, like we said earlier, it's a huge mistake to think that was his only message or even his primary goal.
Okay, so what was the goal?
The purpose, according to how he understood it, wasn't just to scare people endlessly. It was twofold. First, to cause them to look honestly on their sin and their deserved fate. Yes, that part's true. But then, and this is a crucial part often missed then, to joyfully flee to Christ, the sinner's substitute, for salvation. The terror wasn't the point. The terror was meant to show how desperately they needed Christ, how wonderful and necessary salvation was. It was like a doctor giving a very stark diagnosis to drive the patient to the only cure.
So the fear motivates the flight to safety, to joy in Christ. That context is vital. And this was just one sermon among Well, many, many writings.
Oh, absolutely. You can't grasp Edwards without looking beyond sinners. His major works, things like Religious Affections, The Nature of True Virtue, The End for Which God Created the World, these show the incredible depth of his thinking about God's beauty, his excellence, his ultimate plans. They're deeply intellectual, yes, but they're filled with that same spiritual intensity, that same passion.
Religious affection sounds really key, especially for understanding the revival and his own spirituality.
Yeah.
What was he getting at in that book?
Yeah, Religious Affections is his masterwork on figuring out what counts as genuine spiritual experience. The Awakening had all this intense emotion flying around, tears, joy, fear. How do you tell what's really the Holy Spirit working versus, just group psychology or even self-deception?
Right. A crucial question.
Crucial. Edwards argued strongly that true religion consists so much in the affections, meaning deep feelings, passions, desires, inclinations, that there can be no true religion without them. Emotions are central. But then he spent the book laying out careful tests or signs to help distinguish true religious affections from false ones.
Okay, what kinds of signs? How could you tell the difference?
He gave 12 distinguishing signs. For instance, true affections arise from those influences and operations on the heart, which are spiritual, supernatural, and divine. They're from God's work, not just you psyching yourself up. And crucially, their primary object, what they're really about, is God's inherent beauty, holiness. A false affection might get excited about what God does for you, like saving you from hell or making you feel good. A true affection is captivated by who God is in himself, his perfect holiness, his infinite wisdom, his sheer beauty and glory.
That's a subtle but huge difference, what you're actually delighting in.
Exactly, and this leads to different results. True affections produce conviction humiliation practice, meaning a deeper sense of your own sin and unworthiness. That's the humiliation part. And crucially, a consistent life of obedience. Holy practice.
So it's not just about the feeling itself, but where it comes from, what it focuses on, and what it actually does in your life.
Precisely. He stressed you need both light in the understanding as well as an affected, fervent heart. Someone with just light without heat, lots of knowledge but a cold heart, they're missing something vital. But someone with heat without light, strong feelings but no real informed understanding of God, they're missing it too. Yes. He talks about holiness not just as a duty, but as something beautiful, something you can develop a spiritual taste or appetite for. Holiness is that good, which is the immediate object of a spiritual taste. True delight is first in God's perfection, then maybe in your own interest in him. The hypocrite, he says, builds on self-love. The true saint builds their life out of self in God and Jesus Christ.
Wow.
And the number one most reliable proof of this genuine God-focused affection, consistent Christian living, holy practice. He famously called that the sign of signs, the ultimate evidence.
The sign of signs. That really sticks with you. It puts the emphasis on how faith actually plays out. Speaking of practice, there are some fascinating glimpses into his own personal life, his disciplines.
Oh, definitely. His resolutions are almost legendary. He wrote 70 of them when he was quite young. Yeah, covering pretty much every aspect of personal piety and practical Christian living. They show this just remarkable intensity and determination to live completely for God. Things like resolving to live with all my strength while I do live, or never do anything, whether in soul or body, but what tends to the glory of God. It's kind of breathtaking.
It really is.
Now, when he was young, he acknowledged he couldn't do it without God's help. But later, knowing himself better, he wrote more about his own extreme feebleness and impotence. So there's a growth in humility there, too. He used these resolutions not like a checklist to earn points, but as practical reminders and personal standards to keep himself oriented towards God's glory.
That intense self-reflection. And his intellectual work was part of this devotion too, right? Not separate?
Absolutely integrated. You see it in his study habits. His Miscellanies notebook, he started it around 1722, kept adding theological and philosophical thoughts his whole life, ended up with like 1,400 entries.
Yeah.
He wasn't just studying about God in some detached way. The rigorous thinking was his worship. It was how he sought to know and enjoy God more deeply. That's classic Puritanism. Really, the core of religion is conscious communion with God. And for Edwards, deep thought was a pathway to that communion.
And during the revival in Northampton, there were some really powerful personal stories too, weren't there? Showing the human impact.
Oh, yes. During the peak of the revival, the spiritual hunger was so intense. People were flocking to him for counseling constantly, like 4 persons in a day or near 30 in a week for weeks straight. just seeking guidance for their souls.
Incredible demand.
And there's one young woman whose conversion experience was apparently so sudden and joyful it became the greatest occasion of awakening to others. Edwards himself became convinced God had given her a new heart.
And wasn't there a story about a little girl, too?
Yes, a very sweet account of a young girl who felt this profound joy. She talked about remembering lines from her catechism that comforted her. And when someone asked how much she loved God, she just said, simply, she loved him better than anything. These aren't huge theological points, but they show the real personal depth of what was happening, touching even the youngest people with this genuine love for God.
He also encouraged regular folks to pursue these kinds of deep spiritual practices, didn't he?
He did. He really pushed the idea of solitude for his congregation, finding private time for secret converse with God. This wasn't some monk-like thing only for the super spiritual. He saw it as essential for every Christian to deepen their personal relationship with God, to meditate, to pray. Nurturing that inner life was vital for everyone.
So whether it's the terrifying sermon, the deep theology, the personal resolutions, the counseling,
Yeah.
it all seems to point back to that one central goal.
Absolutely. Every single part of his life and work, the preaching, the writing, the pastoring, it was all ultimately aimed to awaken hearts to the all-surpassing glory of God. The fear in sinners was meant to magnify the glory of escaping judgment through Christ. The careful distinctions in religious affections were meant to guide people toward a truly glorious, God-centered experience. His own disciplines flowed from wanting to know and reflect that glory. It was the unifying theme.
This focus on God's glory drove him through the heights of the Great Awakening, but it also, well, it led him into some pretty serious conflicts and trials later on.
It certainly did. Some of the trouble he ran into in Northampton actually had roots in older church controversies, like the whole debate over the halfway covenant.
Right, you mentioned that earlier. His grandfather, Stoddard, was involved.
Yes, Stoddard had debated figures like Increase Mather about it years before. It was about letting baptized people who hadn't professed personal conversion have their kids baptized and participate in some church life, but not communion. It had already caused controversy and schism.
And this old issue flared up again under Edwards.
Big time. It led to what's often called the most agonizing crisis of his life, his dismissal from the Northampton Church in 1750.
Dismissal. After all that time.
Yes. The direct cause was his decision to change the communion requirements. Under his grandfather, the practice had become, well, more relaxed. Edwards came to believe strongly that only those who could give a credible public testimony of personal conversion should be admitted to the Lord's Supper.
A stricter standard.
Much stricter than what people were used to. He had formed this conviction privately and was planning to introduce the change, maybe waiting for a specific situation to arise. But then a key figure in town, Colonel John Stoddard, a relative of Edwards, actually had a stroke and died. This seemed to force the issue into the open, and it caused a massive conflict with powerful people in the church and town who opposed the change.
So his theological convictions clashed directly with the established practice and likely some powerful interests.
Exactly. You could say his deep, non-indulgent, solitary piety, the very thing that made him great, also led to his downfall in Northampton, in a way. His refusal to compromise on what he saw as essential for true church membership angered many in the congregation. The vote to dismiss him was, apparently, overwhelming, pretty brutal.
Wow. How did someone who believes so strongly in God's absolute control, his sovereignty, how did he cope with something like that, being rejected by his own church?
Well, that belief wasn't just theory for him, it was his lifeline. He interpreted his dismissal, like all his trials, as part of God's perfect, sovereign plan.
Even this.
Even this, his conviction was that God was orchestrating everything, even his suffering and rejection, for a purpose. It meant his faith was being tested, refined. He didn't see it as random or unjust misfortune happening outside God's control. He believed God was in it.
That's a hard perspective to hold on to.
Incredibly hard. But it allowed his commitment to God's purposes to remain, even to shine through. It showed how you could, in theory, glorify God, even through deep hardship. His comfort wasn't in knowing why exactly, but in trusting the one who is in control. Even in profound personal grief, like when his daughter Jerusha died, she'd been caring for the missionary, David Brainerd, before she got sick herself. He admitted he struggled at times to stoke his heart. But he also found that it was often in the hardest of hard times that the kindness of the Lord became most apparent. Sovereignty wasn't a cold doctrine. It was the wise, purposeful, even kind hand of God, even when it felt heavy.
Finding kindness in the midst of that kind of loss. That's deep faith. So what happened after Northampton? Where did he go?
He moved his family out to the frontier to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, took on a really challenging job, missionary to the Housatonic Native Americans, and also pastor to the small English congregation there.
Frontier life. Must have been tough.
Very. Stockbridge was described as a frontier town, small but full of factions, and he immediately ran into opposition, especially from some of his own extended family, the Williamses.
Family conflict again.
Yeah, the Williamses were like the local elites, the ones who ran things, and they made life difficult. They tried to control the mission funds and resources, especially the school for the Native American children. Edwards had to fight them pretty hard to protect the mission and advocate for the Native Americans under his care.
Now, there's a difficult aspect here, too, concerning his views and practices regarding race and slavery, right?
Yes, it's important to acknowledge that. The materials note he was not immune to certain racist attitudes and actions, and he did own slaves during his adult life. That's a very difficult part of his historical context and legacy. At the same time, the record also shows that in Stockbridge, he demonstrated clear concern for people whom others neglected. He put real effort into educating the Native Americans, wanting them to learn the faith and participate in colonial societies.
Yeah.
So it's complex. A man reflecting some of the deep flaws of his time while also showing genuine care for marginalized groups in other ways.
It definitely adds that layer of human complexity, reminding us he lived in a different era. And his very last position was different again, wasn't it? A move into academia.
It was. In late 1757, his son-in-law, Aaron Burr Sr., who was president of the College of New Jersey, which we now know as Princeton, died suddenly. Edwards was invited to succeed him.
Quite a shift.
Huge. He was actually inclined to reject the offer at first, felt his work in Stockbridge wasn't done, maybe worried about his health, but influential colleagues persuaded him and he accepted. Tragically, his time there was incredibly short. He died in March 1758, just over a month after taking office, from complications after getting a smallpox inoculation.
Wow, such a brief tenure at Princeton. But despite the challenges, the dismissals, the short stints in some roles, his overall influence has been just massive, hasn't it? Enduring.
Oh, absolutely immense. He's still widely seen as America's greatest evangelical theologian, maybe the greatest American theologian of any kind, period. And interestingly, some of his most important philosophical and theological books, like Freedom of the Will and Original Sin, were written during that relatively quieter period in Stockbridge after the Northampton storm. Those really cemented his intellectual legacy.
Let's touch on those two big ones. Freedom of the will sounds heavy. What was the core idea there, simply put?
It is heavy, but the central argument is fascinating and ties right back to his views on sovereignty and human nature. Edwards wasn't saying our will is physically forced, like a puppet on a string.
Okay.
His point was about our desires. Our choices, he argued, always follow our strongest inclination or desire at that moment. The will freely chooses what the heart wants. But because the fallen human heart is corrupt, inclined towards sin, it will naturally and freely choose sin.
So the will is free, but the desires are bent.
Exactly. The heart is bound with the chains of sin, so its desires lean that way. It will keep freely choosing according to those desires unless the heart itself is fundamentally changed. And for Edwards, only the Holy Spirit's regenerating work could do that, giving the heart a new ability to truly know and love God and then freely choose what is good. It's like a faulty scale. It weighs freely, but its nature makes it give the wrong measurement until it's repaired.
Okay, that makes sense. The problem isn't the choosing mechanism, it's the inclination behind it. What about original sin?
Well, original sin was his major defense of the traditional doctrine that all humanity inherits a sinful nature from Adam. But beyond that, it contains some really profound philosophical stuff about God's continuous relationship to creation. His idea of God's causal self-sufficiency, meaning that everything that exists wholly from him, God, at every single moment. It's not like God wound up the universe at the beginning and just let it run. No. Edwards argued God actively upholds everything in being, continually, from second to second. Without God's constant sustaining power, everything would just vanish.
Wow, that's a strong view of dependence.
Incredibly strong. It was his way of pushing back against any view that made the world seem independent of God. For Edwards, the reality, centrality, and supremacy of God had to be absolute in every atom, every instant. It flowed directly from his overwhelming sense of God's sovereignty and glory.
So even these dense philosophical works were really expressions of that core vision of God.
Totally. His brainpower wasn't just for show. He saw himself as an artful theologian, trying to make all arts and sciences lead back to God, to show all truth points to him. His deep thinking was part of his project to understand and declare God's glory.
So, if we look back at his whole life, the brilliant kid, the life-changing conversion, the intense disciplines, the powerful ministry, the revival work, the frontier mission, enduring the trials, how does it all weave together to really showcase that main theme, glorifying God?
I think his life is the illustration. His mind was dedicated to grasping God's truth. His passionate spiritual life was about tasting and seeing God's beauty. His ministry, whether in Northampton's revival or Stockbridge's struggles, aimed to point people to God's supreme worth. His perseverance through dismissal and hardship showed the reality and even the kindness of God's sovereign hand in suffering. Every piece of it, even the failures and struggles, was lived out coram Deo before the face of God, and ultimately in his framework served to glorify Jesus Christ and reveal the multifaceted glory of God. There's this idea that looking at history or a life from the perspective of the end, where God is, gives you the real insight into its meaning. Edwards's life, seen that way, really testifies to the God he served.
That brings it right back to us then. For people listening today trying to navigate faith, education, life, what are the big takeaways from Jonathan Edwards?
I think there are several powerful ones. First, his model of intellectual rigor in service of devotion. He shows us that thinking hard about God isn't opposed to worship. It can actually fuel it. It deepens our understanding, our awe. It's a challenge, really, to love God with our minds, too, not just our hearts.
That's huge, especially today when those can feel separate. What else?
Second, his focus on true spiritual experience. Remember religious affections. He pushes us to ask, what's the real basis of my faith? Is it self-focused feeling, or is it a genuine response to the actual beauty and holiness of God himself? It challenges us to go beyond superficiality and seek authentic, God-centered affections, which leads right to the third point. His insistence on holy practice as the sign of signs. Actions speak loudest. He reminds us that the most reliable proof of genuine faith isn't just what we say or feel, but how we actually live out Christ's commands. Our obedience is the evidence.
That's a very practical, maybe even uncomfortable challenge, that our lives are the real test.
It really is. And finally, just his overarching example of living entirely for God's honor. His life constantly asks us, what is the ultimate purpose of my life? If God's glory is the main thing, how should that reshape my priorities, my ambitions, my everyday choices? It's a call to reorient everything around God's supreme worth.
So Jonathan Edwards emerges not just as the sinner's preacher, but as this towering figure, theologian, revivalist, philosopher, pastor, whose entire being was consumed with knowing, experiencing, and declaring the glory of God in a God-centered reality.
Yes, a life lived with this incredible singular focus. It really challenges us to think about our own focus, doesn't it? To perhaps recenter our lives more fully on the glory of God revealed in Christ.
And that leaves us, and you listening, with a really vital question to ponder. How can you, in your specific life situation, with your gifts, your struggles, your opportunities, how can you cultivate a deeper sense, a deeper appreciation of God's glory? How do you move from just knowing facts about God to really experiencing and savoring his beauty and majesty so it changes how you live?
And maybe think again about Edwards's sign of signs, holy practice. Obedience flowing from a changed heart as the truest mark of love for God.
Right. So thinking about that connection between love and obedience, practice is the sign. Maybe the final thought for you to reflect on is this. What might be the most surprising or perhaps the most challenging commandment of Christ for you personally to focus on keeping today? What act of obedience could serve as a clear, tangible testament right now to a genuine love for him?